It turns out our deepest assumptions about human differences were wrong. Scientists spent decades collecting DNA from every corner of the planet. They gathered samples from Amazon tribes, Mongolian nomads, Pacific Islanders, and remote villages in the Himalayas. They sequenced millions of genetic markers. This created the largest database of human diversity ever. It promised to finally answer the age-old questions about race, ancestry, and what it means to be human. What they found shattered every assumption we had about race, ancestry, and what it means to be human. The results were so unexpected that some researchers initially thought their equipment was broken. The data showed patterns nobody predicted. It revealed connections no one saw coming. These discoveries made headlines across every major scientific journal in the world. This is what scientists learned when they compared the DNA of every race on Earth. The Human Genome Diversity Project started in the early 1990s. Its goal was controversial. Researchers wanted to collect genetic material from indigenous groups. They aimed to do this before globalization erased these unique populations. Critics called the project unethical. Supporters argued it was essential science. Everyone agreed on one thing: the data would change everything we thought we knew about human variation. The project gathered samples from over 1,000 individuals. These came from 52 populations. 7 major geographic regions were covered: Africa, Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, East Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. Each sample went through advanced sequencing. This technology could read millions of genetic letters in a single run. The raw data alone filled petabytes of server farms. It was an enormous amount of information, all waiting for analysis. When the first analysis came back, researchers saw something immediately. The genetic differences between groups we call races were much smaller than anyone thought. You might see someone from Beijing and someone from Stockholm. They look completely different: skin tones, facial features, hair textures. But at the DNA level, they share 99.9% of their genetic code. That remaining 0.1% is where things got interesting. The data showed that our traditional ideas of race had almost no basis in genetics. An East African person could share more genetic markers with a Southern European than with someone from West Africa. Researchers even found unexpected genetic markers from Papua New Guinea in a Native American population in the Amazon. The neat boxes we created for race did not exist in the actual genetic data. If these categories mean nothing, where does true human genetic diversity lie? The most shocking discovery came from looking at where this genetic variation actually lived. It turns out the greatest genetic diversity on Earth exists within Africa. Not between continents, not between what we call different races. The deepest genetic differences are found right inside the African continent itself. Imagine a bag of 100 marbles, each a different color. This bag holds all the genetic diversity found in humans. Now, randomly grab just 15 of those marbles and put them in a new, smaller bag. This smaller bag represents the genetic diversity that left Africa. Even if those 15 marbles split into different groups and spread across Europe and Asia, they will never have more diversity than what was in that original bag of 100. This is called the founder effect. 2 individuals from neighboring Ethiopian villages can be more genetically different from each other than a random Ethiopian is from a random Norwegian. This makes sense when you understand human migration. Modern humans started in Africa about 300,000 years ago. For most of that time, our ancestors stayed there. Populations mixed, separated, and adapted to different environments. They built up genetic variations over hundreds of thousands of years. The genetic diversity we see across the entire rest of the world is essentially a subset of the diversity that already existed in African populations before anyone left. When small groups finally migrated out of Africa around 70,000 years ago, they carried only a fraction of that total genetic variation with them. A small, pioneering population cannot possibly represent the full genetic diversity of their origin population. They are just a sample. That sample becomes the foundation for all future populations in new territories. If you find this deep dive into our shared past as fascinating as we do, subscribe. We are just getting started on how this one idea changes everything. This pattern held true for every migration route scientists could trace. Genetic diversity dropped the further populations moved from Africa. European groups showed less diversity than those in the Middle East. East Asian populations had less diversity than Central Asian ones. Native American populations, who traveled the furthest and crossed the Bering Land Bridge in one of the last major migrations, showed the least genetic diversity of all. The data revealed more than just decreasing diversity. Scientists found something even more surprising when they looked at specific genes. The genes that determine visible traits like skin color, hair texture, and facial features make up less than 0.1% of our entire genome. These are the traits we use to categorize race. These are the traits that have driven centuries of discrimination, slavery, and genocide. They represent a tiny, almost negligible fraction of human genetic variation, and those traits evolved incredibly recently in human history. The mutation for light skin in European populations appeared only about 8,000 years ago. Blue eyes emerged even more recently, between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. They came from a single ancestor near the Black Sea. East Asian populations developed their unique eyelid fold through a separate genetic pathway. It has nothing to do with European features. These physical differences we fixate on are extremely new evolutionary adaptations to local environments. They are surface-level changes. They happened in the blink of an eye compared to our species' total history. Meanwhile, the traits we do not see carry far more genetic complexity. This includes disease resistance, metabolic efficiency, brain development, and immune system function. These traits show massive variation within every population group. You cannot predict someone's intelligence, athletic ability, or health risks based on what they look like. The genes that matter for those traits are distributed randomly across all human populations. The DNA research found something else that challenged many long-held beliefs about ancestry. Most people carry genetic markers from several different regions. Take someone who identifies as Chinese. Their DNA might show traces from Central Asian groups. Someone who identifies as European could carry Middle Eastern ancestry. And a person from the Caribbean almost certainly has a mix of African, European, and indigenous American ancestry. This genetic mixing is not new. It did not start with modern travel or globalization. It has been happening throughout human history, whenever different groups met. Studies of ancient DNA show that Europeans today inherited genetic material from at least 3 distinct ancestral populations. These were early European farmers, indigenous hunter-gatherers, and Yamnaya herders from the Eurasian steppes. None of these groups were ever pure or isolated. They were already blends of even older populations. This pattern shows up everywhere scientists look. East Asians have ancestry from multiple waves of migration. Pacific Islanders descend from at least 2 separate colonization events, combining Austronesian seafarers with indigenous peoples. Even populations we once thought were cut off show gene flow from neighboring groups over thousands of years. The data completely demolished the concept of racial purity. There has never been a pure race. No isolated population has ever existed without mixing with others, given enough time and opportunity. The entire idea that you can draw clean genetic lines between racial groups falls apart under genomic analysis. But if race is not genetic and purity is a myth, why do we still see such obvious physical differences between groups? Think about dolphins and sharks. They both have streamlined bodies and fins. One is a mammal, the other is a fish. They found similar solutions to similar challenges in the ocean. This is convergent evolution. Human physical differences work the same way. Our visible traits are adaptations to local environments. When people spread across the globe, they met wildly different climates. They faced high altitudes, intense sun, and new diseases. Natural selection favored traits that helped them survive in those conditions. Dark skin offered protection from strong ultraviolet radiation near the equator. Light skin helped people make enough vitamin D in northern areas with less sunlight. The epicanthic fold, common in East Asian populations, likely shielded eyes from cold winds and bright snow glare. These adaptations emerged independently in different groups facing similar environmental pressures. It is convergent evolution. People in southern India and Aboriginal Australians both developed dark skin. They are genetically distinct and live far apart. Their skin color evolved convergently because both groups lived in places with strong sun. The genetic changes that cause dark skin in each population are actually different. They arrived at the same solution using different genetic paths. Similar environmental pressures produce similar solutions even when the underlying biology takes different routes to get there. The story of human adaptation gets even more complex. Some traits define neat geographic patterns. Take the ability to digest lactose into adulthood. This trait shows up in populations that historically raised dairy cattle. That includes Northern Europeans, East African pastoralist groups, and some communities in Central Asia. This trait is absent in most East Asian populations. It is also missing in many African groups. This is true even if those groups live geographically close to populations who have the trait. The trait spread based on culture and dairy farming practices, not based on racial categories. High-altitude adaptations show similar patterns. Tibetan populations developed genetic changes. These changes help them process oxygen more efficiently at extreme elevations. In South America, Andean populations evolved different genetic adaptations to achieve the same result. Both groups can survive at altitudes that would cause serious health problems for lowland populations. But they got there through completely different genetic mechanisms. They adapted independently to similar environmental challenges. The genetic data revealed one more crucial finding. Researchers initially struggled to explain this. Some genetic traits associated with disease susceptibility do cluster in certain geographic populations. Sickle cell anemia appears more frequently in people with West African ancestry. Tay-Sachs disease shows higher rates in Ashkenazi Jewish populations. Cystic fibrosis affects European populations more than others. The disease clusters seem to support racial genetic, meaning how does the data contradict this initial impression? These disease patterns seem to support the idea that race had genetic meaning, but closer study showed something different. These disease variants did not spread because of race. They spread because they offered a survival advantage against local threats. Take the sickle cell mutation. It protects against malaria, a disease common in West Africa. Having one copy of the gene gave people resistance to malaria without causing sickle cell disease. Natural selection favored this mutation in areas where malaria was a major killer. This happened regardless of how we might classify those populations racially. The same pattern explains other disease clusters tied to certain places. These are not proof of deep genetic differences between races. They are proof of how evolution responds to specific environmental dangers. A person from West Africa and someone from Southern Europe, both from areas with malaria, might carry malaria resistance genes. We would call them different races, but their genes tell a similar story. Meanwhile, two people we group as the same race could have very different disease risks. This depends on where their ancestors lived and the diseases they faced. The genomic data changed how doctors used race to guess genetic risk. A doctor who assumes all patients of a certain race have the same risks makes dangerous assumptions. Science does not support this. Individual genetic testing gives a much more accurate risk assessment than racial categories ever could. If science proves race is not genetic, where did this powerful, pervasive concept come from? The idea of distinct human races first appeared in the 1700s and 1800s. European scientists began to classify human diversity. They treated people the same way they categorized plants and animals. They built hierarchies based on how people looked and what cultural practices they followed. They ranked these races from best to worst, claiming some were superior. They used these classifications to justify colonialism, slavery, and genocide. These early scientists said they were just following objective observation. But their conclusions were shaped by the prejudices and power structures of their time. They saw differences in technology and social organization between groups. They decided these differences meant innate biological inferiority. They ignored historical and environmental circumstances. They turned temporary cultural differences into permanent genetic categories. Modern genetics completely dismantled these racial hierarchies. The traits those early scientists used to define and rank races have no link to intelligence, morality, or civilization level. They do not correlate with any measure of human worth. The tiny genetic differences that do exist between populations are either neutral or help people adapt to local conditions. The most important discovery was not what scientists found, but what they did not find. They found no genetic reason for borders. They found no support for racial nationalism. There was no proof that any group was more evolved or more human than another. What they found, instead, was a single species. We all share a recent common origin. We have a shared genetic heritage. This makes all of our surface differences unimportant in the bigger picture. The DNA comparison showed that our most recent common ancestor lived only about 3,000 years ago. That means if you go back just 120 generations, you will find an ancestor connected to literally every person alive today. Your family tree and the family tree of someone on the other side of the world meet at this very recent point in time. Go back a little further, to about 7,000 years ago. Every person alive today shares the exact same set of ancestors. Everyone living in 7000 BCE who has any descendants today is an ancestor to all 8 billion people currently alive. That includes people from ancient Mesopotamia, farmers in the Yellow River Valley, and hunter-gatherers in southern Africa. If they have descendants today, you are one of them. So is everyone else on Earth. This finding destroys the idea of pure ancestral lines. You do not come from just one ancient group. You come from all of them. Your ancestry is not a straight line back to a single starting point. It is a massive web that covers the entire human family tree. If you feel a stronger connection to one ancestral group over another, it is because of culture, not genetics. The genetic data also showed surprising links between groups separated by huge distances. Some Native American populations have genetic markers found in Siberian populations. This confirms migration routes across the Bering Land Bridge. But they also carry traces of ancient genes from groups related to Aboriginal Australians and Papua New Guineans. How did genes from Oceania get to the Americas tens of thousands of years ago? Scientists are still putting that story together, but the data proves human migration was far more complex than a simple movement out of Africa. This scientific truth has profound implications for how we understand and address social inequalities. The categories we invented to divide humanity do not match the real patterns in our DNA. We created the idea of race to build social hierarchies. Then, we convinced ourselves these hierarchies were natural biological divisions. The genetic data proves they never were. This does not mean racism has no real effects. Social categories based on race have shaped who gets resources, opportunities, and power for centuries. People categorized into different racial groups have vastly different lived experiences. This is true even if the genetic basis for those categories does not exist. Understanding that race is not genetic does not erase the very real social and economic consequences of racism. But it does mean we cannot hide behind claims of natural differences. We cannot say biology dictates destiny. There is no genetic explanation for why some groups have power and others do not. There is no DNA-based reason for unequal resource distribution. The gaps we see in wealth, health, education, and opportunity come from historical and ongoing social systems. They are not inevitable results of genetic differences between populations. The scientists who compared DNA from every corner of Earth gave us a tool. It dismantles centuries of pseudo-scientific racism. They prove that beneath our superficial differences, we are far more alike than different. They showed that human diversity is a beautiful spectrum of adaptation and variation, not a hierarchy. They confirmed we are all part of one human family with a shared ancestry and a common future. This changed everything we thought we knew about what it means to be human. It gave us the evidence to finally move past the destructive fiction of biological race. What we choose to do with that evidence is up to us. Subscribe if this kind of scientific truth is something you want to see applied to real-world problems. And tell me in the comments, what social division do you think science could help us move past next?